Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning into the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams, our co-host. Daniel, good to see you.
How are you this morning, Dr. Paul?
I'm doing very well, and I'm hoping that we talk about some good news today.
We need some good news.
We keep looking for it, and even when it's a little bit, we try to encourage good news and promote the ideas that will give us a better world. And this good news, at least that we'd like to paint as good news, there's a few people who would argue with us. The neocons are not going to agree with us that this is good news. This is a threat to the neocons. And what I would like to visit with you on is the fact that the North Koreans that aren't looked favorably by the administration or the rest of the world, and of course the deep state and the military-industrial complex, they have to paint them in the worst light. But the president of North Korea, the dictator, if you say, of North Korea, has offered a bit of an olive branch to the South Koreans. He said, why don't we talk? Can't we get together and talk? And he wants to have a meeting, and he wants, I think it was said in this report that he wanted to bring up the subject of the North Koreans actually participating in sports, not only with the South Koreans, but in the Olympic sports that will be, in South Korea. I think that is fine. There was a time when the President of the United States said that we ought to play ping pong with the Chinese. Yeah. And it led to better arrangements, slowly but steadily and not imperfectly, but at least it erased the memory, or at least it diminished the memory that I had in high school, where friends and relatives were going off to Korea and fighting the Chinese and people dying. So this to me is a good thing, I think. And, President Moon of South Korea actually campaigned on, why don't we at least talk to them? So all they're asking for is to talk. How can anybody be opposed to just talking?
That's true. Unfortunately, we'll get into the one person who is opposed to it. Yeah. But, it's been a week of pretty good news. We've got bad news in places like Iran, possibly with maybe the U.S. fiddling around with their unrest. But this is a bit of good news because, it started on Monday. The North Koreans said that they would send a delegation to the Olympics. And that's a big thing, I think. And then Tuesday, the South Koreans countered with an offer of high-level talks. That's a good thing, too. And then just yesterday, the North Koreans reestablished direct communication, a groundbreaking cross-border communications channel with South Korea. That had been down for a good couple of years. They reestablished those channels. And so that's really kind of a trifecta of three pretty good things happening this week. Well,
what I find interesting is that they had to take this to a special or a certain individual in South Korea, and he's the unification minister. So they already have somebody there that's been promoting this all along. And of course, we've talked about this before, because anytime they get close to doing something or setting up visits with North Korea, which would be just a slight crack in the door, and this might be just a slightly bigger crack, and it's not much there, but it should be encouraged. But as soon as that happens, there's a certain government that we're well aware of and is very close to us that we disagree with frequently, and that is our own government, puts a damper on it. Say, no way, you shouldn't do this. We have rules, and this is what they have to do. They have to bow down. They have to crawl to us. Yeah. And otherwise, we have an option, and we emphasize that option. Of course, that option is that nothing is off the table, which is implying that we will start the war. There's so many things that they have said that have implied, if you don't do it, if you keep testing your missiles, that we will, strike that and make sure you can't do it. And the real tragedy is most people in America, say, hey, that's great. We got to be tough. We got to worry about them. They have a nuke that can reach California, which is not quite true, because even when you talk, even when you listen to Mattis, he has a different story on that.
That's true, and it's the issue is, the North and South talking, and then the U.S. coming in and saying we don't like it. And Nikki Haley, who we point to a lot because she's sort of the poster child of the neoconservative rot that's taken over the Trump administration, but she countered right away and said, no way, as you say, no way, no talks. North Korea's got to give up their nukes. And I think what that does is it sets up the U.S. to being irrelevant, and
That's
this is, irrelevant to the process.
And the credibility goes down. But in some sense, the credibility of doing harm, I think it's good we lose our credibility there because we haven't achieved peace. We've achieved a lot of fighting and killing and bombing and initiating force when you think about, especially the last 20 years. I mean, what we've been doing in the Middle East, a lot of people have died. Americans don't realize it because, they figure, well, not too many Americans are dying, so it must be okay. But she's determined, and she comes across to me as somebody, as tough as she is. When I see people acting like that, I keep thinking, why are they so weak?
Yeah.
Why can't you be tough by firm convictions and letting people know and looking for the right thing to do and just calmly do it and let the message speak for itself? But when they have to shout in a way of, don't do that, but she has an audience out there that like that. When it comes to the military-industrial complex, that's what they want. They don't want, I don't think they really want war. They're not saying, we need a war in Korea. I don't think they do. But they just do things that very well could lead to war. But they just want to stir up trouble and always have an enemy. So this would diminish the enemy. What if they do get together and talk and they invite and they allow the North Koreans to come in? But of course that involves more than South Korea, but because it would be the Olympic Committee probably has to get involved. But I think a movement in that direction would be wonderful. I think sports really should be used in a positive way, but so often they're used in a political way. And unfortunately right now we see the NFL being used in the wrong way because it's militarism and super patriotism and all that complex issue. So sports should be left alone. It should be left for enjoyment and having fun and diminishing that. I remember sincerely, I made the statement when I left Congress the first time that because I enjoyed playing baseball against a Democrat, I said, we need to play more baseball. and I think the world needs to play more baseball, more sports, more football, and more Olympics.
Peter Van Buuren, who we've had on the show when he's been a speaker at our conference last year, he's written a couple of times and he states it very strongly. He's a former State Department official, and he said there's no way the U.S. is going to start a war with North Korea. It's not going to happen. Millions would die. Just a lot of fluff. Don't get overexcited. He probably has a pretty good point. But the bellicosity of people like Trump and of Nikki Haley, the bellicosity leads things toward the brink, but it also really underscores the impotence of the U.S. Can't really start a war where a few million people will die. 250,000 Americans live in South Korea. How many of those would die? So they bluster and bluster and bluster, and what is the bluster when it's not really backed up by anything? In reality, it just becomes impotence. It becomes irrelevance. And you mentioned the Middle East. This is what happened ultimately in Syria. The U.S. kept pounding its fists on the table and stamping its feet. Assad must go. And meanwhile, the Russians and the Iranians came in quietly and sorted out the problem with ISIS and then started working toward a political agreement.
Not only is the bellicosity is bad, but it's also the mixed signals that they send. They're all over the place. Remember, it wasn't too long ago that Tillerson spoke publicly and said that, we have a backdoor arrangement. We're trying to reach the North Koreans for talks. Trump went nuts. No, that's not true, and blast him. Everybody said, well, Tillerson has to go. How could they have this much confrontation? But that settled down. Tillerson backed off, and then Trump comes along and says that we can't do this. The same way on this. They don't let us know where they really stand on these issues. At the same time, we have the Secretary of Defense, like I mentioned before, Mattis. He says they don't have the nuclear capability. They don't have it. And I agree that the odds of North Korea initiating violence against another country, whether it's South Korea or the Japanese or American property, I think zero The only way it's going to happen is an accident or a false flag. But he's not going to do that. But we're the ones who are always threatening, aggression and say, you do it our way or else. It's not the way to win friends and influence people. Matter of fact, I think this is a reason that we're losing our stature around the world. And I think it's significant. It's too bad we wouldn't lose it by a deliberate change in policy, acting more responsibly and more like adults, and saying, look, this is the way the world should work, and we should be open to negotiations. And, and when you look back to the people that we do deal with, this whole argument, well, he's a bad guy. Do you think that UN has killed or caused more trouble and violated more civil liberties than Saudi Arabia? I mean, he's far from an angel, but Saudi Arabia is our best friend, and we support them in their war or the destruction of Yemen. It's just the hypocrisy that bothers me.
Yeah, and you say that they're not going to start a war, not because people say, oh, well, look at this guy, he's defending, not because you're defending Kim, not because we think he's a great guy, but because he's shown all along that he acts in his own self-interest. He's, for whatever his faults, I'm sure there are plenty of them, like with many other rulers, he's not shown himself to be a madman or stupid. He's calculating. He's looking out to his national interest. Doesn't mean we like him or have to like him, but the fact is he acts in his own self-interest. It would be massively opposed to his self-interest to just willy-nilly start firing missiles.
Now, the response from the South to the North Koreans was, very open. Yes, sounds like a good idea. Let's talk about it. Let's not only talk about the Olympics, it's, brought in our talks. At the same time, the people say that, well, why not have more talks? We should do these things. But no, they come along and say, no, we can't dare do this. And the Americans come down and say, well, no, you shouldn't. But the one downside of this was Moon, who I think at heart is probably would agree with what we're saying. He said, well, I think it was Moon, but it was somebody representing South Korean. Well, we need to at least talk to United States. Is he going to talk to Nikki Haley? Or why don't they listen to what Donald Trump is saying? No wonder they might want to do it on their own. It's in their own interest. It's in the interest of the South Koreans and the North Koreans. So the South Koreans have the most at stake, and your point, I think, is something they forget all the time. A lot of Americans are at stake, too, on the immediate response. We could argue the case. I don't believe for a minute that the North Koreans are capable of launching a missile that would hit the United States. I don't think they would. I don't think they can. But they have a lot of other weapons. If we do something, if we start this, South Korea is in bad trouble. Yeah. So that's why we like to, on this program, emphasize, well, if there is an opening and people are acting halfway civil. I mean, if we could talk to Khrushchev and other monsters around the world when things were tough and not try to reform their government before we would talk to them, it's a different story. But I think there's a sincere effort in many people. I bet you the large majority of North Koreans and South Koreans would like to talk with each other and visit with each other and talk about unification. I think the big thing that stirs the pot, unfortunately, is something we help pay for through our taxes, and that is us dictating to them exactly what they can do or can't do, and just stirring up the trouble between the two factions.
And that's what you talk about. That's the real danger of the U.S. empire. You mentioned that the North and South would like to talk, but South Korea is very cautious, and we've got to check with the U.S. first. And that's because we wield so much power, military power and economic power. We can put so much pressure on South Korea to prevent them from lowering the tension. And that's sort of the perverse effects of the U.S. empire, which is supposed to keep us safer. That's what they say. But in fact, it keeps us less safe. But I would just close, if I can, for a second and point out we can't let the show pass without mentioning this ridiculous issue of the buttons. I mean, and it makes me so depressed that here, You know, the left is sort of buffoonish and superficial in their critique of Trump, unfortunately. But Trump just opens that door and walks right in. Hey, I've got a bigger button. I've got a bigger button. It's just embarrassing.
No, I agree with that absolutely. And not only did he say he had a bigger button, he said he had a bigger bomb too, which is sending a message. And unfortunately, this is what it's boiled down to, and it's so silly, but it's so dangerous for this type of rhetoric. And sometimes I wonder, you know, what it's all going to lead to. But I do not believe that type of talk makes a whole lot of sense, and I would like to see much more sense. I'd like to see them playing sports. I'd like to see if they don't end up with North Koreans in the Olympics, which may be more complicated, who knows. But why can't the South Koreans and the North Koreans play a game of soccer? That's what I'd like to see. Let them play in the DMZ, you know, let them play there and have a soccer game. That's what I would suggest for them. I was right at the edge of the DMZ when I was in the Air Force, and it's an eerie feeling, but that was in 1961 when I was there. And that was a different story. Things are different now. And just as they're different in Cuba, there's more reason now for it to be more sensible. But what we need to do as Americans is try to be a little bit consistent about why some of the monsters of the world, they're our best friends and we deal with them and work with them, and some people who might not be so nice, but they're not necessarily a threat to us, pretend that they are the greatest threat in the world, and then we resort to either listening to the military-industrial complex or feeling like insecure and unsafe, and therefore we have to be a bully. There's an answer to this, and that is just, you know, be a nation that's, you know, influential in the sense of passing, you know, spreading a message of liberty which produces wealth and prosperity, and also have a national defense, but not to try to take on the job of running the world and policing the world. That leads to problems, and it never works. Eventually, it always ends in a disaster. And right now, we're on a course to a major change in this country, mainly because of our financial system, and that foreign policy is a big contributor to this. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.